At Christmas dinner, my grandmother handed each of us a check for $50 million. Everyone at the table burst out laughing. My brother-in-law sneered, calling her delusional, while his wife ripped the paper into tiny pieces. I quietly folded mine and slipped it into my pocket. The next morning, I stood in the lobby of the largest bank in the city. The branch manager looked at the check, and the color completely drained from his face. He pulled me into a private room, locked the door, and whispered that we needed to talk. My name is Elise, and I am 33 years old. For my entire life, I was the designated punching bag of my family. While they flaunted their supposed wealth, I quietly built my own tech empire as a data analyst. I had recently sold a predictive risk software to a Wall Street hedge fund for a small fortune. My family knew absolutely nothing about my hidden success. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. The climax of their cruelty happened last Christmas Eve at a Michelin star restaurant downtown. My parents Richard and Beatrice had booked the private dining room to celebrate my sister Penelope and her husband Jamal. Jamal is a highly successful African-American corporate attorney who never misses a chance to show off his courtroom arrogance. They sat at the head of the table, clinking crystal glasses of champagne loud and boastful. I sat quietly at the far end next to my grandmother Josephine. Josephine was 82 years old. My parents treated her like a burden, claiming she was losing her mind. They forced her to live in the cramped guest house of their estate. But I knew Josephine better than anyone. Her mind was sharper than a razor. Richard tapped his fork against his glass to demand silence. He wanted to make a toast to Jamal for closing a massive real estate deal for the family business. Before Richard could speak, Josephine reached into her vintage handbag. She pulled out 4 crisp envelopes and slid one across the table to Richard, one to Beatrice, one to Penelope and Jamal, and the last one to me. Beatrice rolled her eyes, sighing loudly. She asked Josephine what kind of nonsense this was. Josephine simply smiled and told them to open the envelopes. I broke the seal on mine and pulled out a cashier check. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was made out to me for exactly $50 million. A loud bark of laughter erupted from the other end of the table. Jamal picked up his check, shaking his head in mock pity. He loudly declared that Grandma had finally lost her remaining marbles. He said she was handing out Monopoly money. Penelope let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She looked at Josephine with pure disdain and said fake banknotes could not buy her the new designer bag she wanted. Without a second thought, Jamal ripped the $50 million check right down the middle, tearing it into tiny confetti-sized pieces and dropping them onto his dessert plate. Beatrice snatched her envelope and shoved it into her purse without even looking at it, muttering about how humiliating this was. Richard glared at Josephine. He told her to stop acting like an absolute idiot and ruining their expensive dinner. Then Richard looked at me. He saw the check still resting in my hands. He reached over and violently shoved my dinner plate aside, spilling gravy onto the white tablecloth just to make room for his extra bottle of wine. Beatrice sneered at me. She said I was 33 years old, working a miserable data entry job, and asked if I was actually stupid enough to believe this senile fantasy. She told me I was an embarrassment to the family name. Penelope chimed in, demanding that I move out of the downtown apartment I was currently renting. Penelope reminded me that Jamal managed the property under the family business. She told me they needed the unit for one of Jamal's wealthy lawyer friends by the end of the month. Jamal smiled maliciously and told me to find a cheap motel where I belonged. I did not cry. I did not argue. I had spent years mastering my emotions around these people. I simply folded the pristine check, tucked it safely into the inner pocket of my coat, and stood up from the table. I looked at Beatrice and Richard, telling them to enjoy their meal, and I walked out of the restaurant without a backward glance. I left them sitting in their arrogance, entirely unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. The next morning, I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking coffee when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the headquarters of the Royal Wealth Management Bank. I answered, and a frantic voice introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell, the senior branch manager. He asked if I was Elise, the granddaughter of Josephine. I confirmed. He told me to come to his private office immediately. He said it was a matter of extreme urgency regarding the check I had received the night before. I grabbed my coat, my pulse quickening, and hailed a cab to the financial district. When I arrived at the massive glass and steel banking headquarters, a security guard was already waiting for me by the revolving doors. He addressed me respectfully by name and escorted me past the long lines of regular customers directly into the executive elevator. We rode up to the top floor in complete silence. The elevator doors opened to reveal a luxurious reception area. Mr. Caldwell was pacing behind his massive oak desk when I walked into his office. He was a distinguished man in a tailored suit, but his tie was slightly loosened and beads of sweat dotted his forehead. He practically lunged forward to shake my hand, quickly locking the heavy mahogany door behind me. He gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair. I reached into my coat pocket, retrieved the folded check, and placed it on his desk. He let out a long breath, staring at the piece of paper as if it were a holy relic. He pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the signature, the routing numbers, and the specific watermark embedded in the paper. After a tense minute, he looked up at me with an expression of absolute gravity. He told me the check was completely real. My grandmother Josephine was not crazy. She was the sole owner of a massive hidden portfolio, including a highly lucrative lithium mine in Nevada that had just been liquidated. Caldwell opened a thick legal binder on his desk. He explained that Josephine had set up a highly secretive living trust years ago. The 4 checks handed out at Christmas dinner were not just gifts. They were a carefully designed test. The trust stipulated that the checks functioned as instruments of distribution. Anyone who rejected, mocked, or destroyed their check would automatically trigger a forfeiture clause. By ripping the check into pieces, Jamal had legally renounced all claims to the fortune on behalf of himself and Penelope. By shoving hers into her purse while insulting Josephine, Beatrice had failed the respect clause. Caldwell tapped a specific paragraph in the legal document. He said that because I was the only person who accepted the gift with grace and retained the physical document intact, I was now the sole beneficiary of the entire trust. The $50 million was just the liquid cash portion. The check also served as the physical key to unlock a private vault downstairs, which held the controlling documents for the remaining $100 million of her estate. I sat completely frozen. My grandmother had played a masterful game of chess, using my family-owned toxic arrogance to disinherit them completely. But Caldwell was not finished. His expression turned grim as his desk phone buzzed with an urgent flashing red light. He answered it on speaker. His assistant voice filled the room, trembling with panic. She said, "Jamal, my brother-in-law, had just filed an emergency injunction with the state court at 8 o'clock this morning declaring Josephine mentally incompetent. They were trying to freeze all her assets immediately." Caldwell looked at me, his face pale. He said if I did not sign the release forms to secure this money in the next 10 minutes, the entire $50 million would be locked away by my family forever. I snatched the heavy titanium pen from Caldwell's desk without hesitating for a fraction of a second. My hand flew across the release forms, signing my name on the dotted lines as Caldwell frantically typed authorization codes into his secure terminal. The tension in the room was suffocating. If Jamal's injunction registered in the Royal Wealth Management System, before these transfers cleared, my grandmother's entire fortune would be trapped in legal limbo for years. I slashed my final signature across the trust acceptance document and shoved the thick stack of papers back across the mahogany desk. Caldwell grabbed them, stamped them with the bank's official seal, and slammed his finger onto the enter key of his keyboard. A loud chime echoed from his computer. The screen flashed bright green, indicating a successful wire transfer. Less than 30 seconds later, Caldwell's office phone rang again. He answered it, listened for a moment, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. He hung up and looked at me, letting out a long breath. He told me the emergency court injunction had just hit their legal department, demanding a total freeze on Josephine's accounts. Caldwell adjusted his tie, his professional composure returning. He said it was a shame for my brother, because as of 30 seconds ago, those specific accounts no longer contained a single dime. The $50 million was now completely insulated within my private offshore holding company. I thanked Caldwell, gathered my coat, and walked out of the bank with a newfound sense of lethal calm. I did not go celebrate or buy a luxury car. Instead, I got on the subway and headed straight to my mundane day job. I worked as a mid-level data analyst for a logistics firm downtown. My family constantly mocked my career, viewing my cubicle life as proof of my absolute mediocrity. They had no idea that my boring job was the perfect cover, providing me with unrestricted access to global financial databases and high-tier data scraping software. I sat down at my gray desk, surrounded by coworkers who barely acknowledged my existence. I logged into my dual monitors, pulling up the logistics routing software on one screen to maintain appearances. On the second highly encrypted screen, I went to war. I immediately wired a massive retainer to an elite cutthroat corporate law firm based in New York. I instructed them to form a shell corporation and begin aggressively buying up every single outstanding loan, mortgage, and bond tied to my father's manufacturing business. While I was executing these trades, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. I answered cautiously. A shaky, hushed voice spoke on the other end. It was Arthur Pendleton, the elderly family attorney who had served my grandfather decades ago. Arthur had always been the only person in our family's orbit who treated Josephine with genuine respect. He sounded absolutely terrified. Arthur told me he was hiding in a stairwell at the courthouse. He said Brock and Jamal had just bulldozed their way into a closed-door hearing with a friendly judge. They were not just trying to freeze the bank accounts anymore. Arthur revealed they had filed an emergency psychiatric hold, claiming Josephine was a danger to herself and suffering from severe dementia. Jamal had bribed a shady private doctor to sign a falsified affidavit. Arthur warned me that they planned to arrive at the estate tomorrow morning with a police escort. Their goal was to forcibly remove Josephine from her home strip, her of all basic human rights, and lock her away in a grim state-run psychiatric facility, where she would have no access to the outside world. Once she was committed, Jamal would have the legal authority to seize the remainder of her hidden $100 million estate. My blood boiled. They were willing to throw an 82-year-old woman into an asylum just to fund their lavish lifestyle. Arthur begged me to do something, warning me that Jamal was a ruthless legal operator who left no loose ends. I told Arthur to stay quiet and not to alert them that he had tipped me off. I ended the call and immediately pivoted my strategy. I could not just play defense from the shadows anymore. I needed to build an impenetrable fortress around my grandmother. I used my encrypted terminal to contact a private security contractor composed of former military operatives. I wired them $500,000 up front, instructing them to deploy a full protection detail to my parents' estate by midnight. I also contacted the top geriatric neurologist in the state, offering triple his usual rate to clear his schedule and prepare for a comprehensive legally binding mental evaluation of Josephine to counter Jamal's fake affidavit. With Josephine's immediate safety set in motion, I turned my attention to the bombshell Caldwell had dropped on me earlier: the identity theft. Brock forging my signature on a $3 million corporate loan was a severe crime, but knowing my brother's insatiable greed, I highly doubted he stopped at just one loan. I cracked my knuckles, opened my proprietary data scraping tools, and began hunting through the public financial registries and corporate filings. I cross-referenced the tax identification numbers of my father's manufacturing company against my own personal social security number. It took my algorithm only 12 minutes to break through the obfuscation layers Jamal had set up. The results populated on my screen, and the sheer scale of their betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Brock had not just forged my name on one loan, he had used my identity to establish an entire network of shadow LLCs. There were over 24 high-interest toxic loans registered in my name across 5 different states. The total debt was not $3 million. It was closer to $28 million. I stared at the glowing numbers, realizing the true depths of Jamal's legal manipulation. They had known the family business was going to collapse. Jamal had expertly structured these toxic corporate loans so that when the company inevitably declared bankruptcy, the creditors and the federal investigators would not go after Brock, Richard, or Beatrice. The paper trail was meticulously designed to point directly to me. They had framed me as the mastermind behind the embezzlement. When the music stopped playing, they planned to let me take the fall, leaving me to face decades in federal prison while they walked away clean. I grabbed my coat and walked straight out of the logistics firm. My next stop was the glass tower that housed my father's manufacturing headquarters. The cab dropped me off right in front of the towering building. I marched through the revolving doors with a singular lethal focus. The receptionist in the penthouse lobby tried to stop me, calling out that Brock was in a private meeting and could not be disturbed, but I completely ignored her. I pushed open the heavy double doors to his corner office without bothering to knock. Brock was not in a meeting. He was practicing his golf putt on a synthetic green unrolled across his imported Persian rug. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that easily cost more than my car. He looked up, clearly annoyed, leaning heavily on his expensive putter. He asked what I was doing there, complaining that I was tracking dirty snow onto his pristine floor. He told me to make an appointment next time I wanted to beg for a handout. I did not waste my time with pleasantries or sisterly greetings. I walked straight up to his massive mahogany desk and dropped my hands onto the polished wood. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I knew about the $28 million in toxic corporate loans. I told him I knew he had used my social security number, stolen my identity, and forged my signature to secure the debt while he was actively bankrupting our father's company. Brock did not panic. He did not scramble to deny it or beg for my silence. Instead, he let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He tossed his silver putter onto the leather sofa and walked over to his private wet bar to pour himself a glass of expensive scotch. He looked at me with pure, unfiltered condescension. He said I was being incredibly dramatic over standard corporate restructuring. He actually had the nerve to tell me I should be flattered that my pristine, unused credit score was finally serving a real purpose for the family legacy. He called me a financial illiterate who could not possibly understand the complexities of high-level capital management. Before I could respond to his staggering arrogance, the office door clicked open. Tanya strolled in carrying a stack of thick legal folders. She wore a designer pencil skirt and heavy diamond earrings paid for by the very money they had stolen in my name. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me, her lips curling into a vicious sneer. She asked Brock why the stray dog was barking in his office and demanded to know how I had gotten past security. Brock chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. He casually told Tanya that I had somehow stumbled upon their little financial strategy. Tanya's eyes hardened instantly. She dropped her legal folders onto the desk and stepped right into my personal space. She used her height and her aggressive corporate lawyer persona to try and physically intimidate me. She poked a sharply manicured finger hard against my chest. Tanya told me to listen to her very carefully. She said I was a nobody. She told me I was a pathetic, low-level data clerk living a miserable, lonely life. She freely admitted they used my identity to secure the loans, but she framed it as a necessary and noble sacrifice for the greater good of the family. She said if the manufacturing company went under Harold, and Beatrice would lose their sprawling estate, she and Brock would lose their vital social standing and their luxury lifestyle. But if I took the fall for the financial collapse, it was just one irrelevant person going to prison. She told me I should be proud to finally be useful to the people who graciously tolerated my existence. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not flinch, I did not cry, and I did not back away from her pointing finger. My phone was sitting in my coat pocket, silently recording every single word of their arrogant criminal confession. But I needed the hard data to match the audio recording. I needed the smoking gun. As Tanya continued her vicious monologue about my utter worthlessness, I shifted my weight, leaning casually against Brock's desk. My left hand slipped behind his open laptop monitor. I retrieved a customized micro flash drive from my sleeve. It was a specialized data extraction tool I had developed myself at my tech agency. I blindly slotted it into the open USB port on his docking station. The drive immediately began quietly cloning his local storage, his cached server access keys, and his hidden financial directories. I needed to keep Tanya and Brock distracted while the progress bar filled. I asked them how they possibly planned to get away with this when the federal auditors eventually arrived to investigate the bankruptcy. Brock smirked, walking over to stand shoulder to shoulder with his wife. He said Tanya was a senior partner at the most ruthless law firm in the city. He boasted that she had already manufactured a flawless paper trail showing I was the shadow director of the offshore shell companies. They had fabricated emails routed through my home IP address. They had forged authorization logs. Tanya smiled wickedly, her eyes gleaming with malice. She told me that if I went to the police, she would personally bury me in so much aggressive litigation that I would never see the light of day. She promised to have me legally disbarred from any corporate job and threatened to have me committed to a psychiatric ward right next to my grandmother. They felt completely invincible. They truly believed their stolen wealth and their legal titles made them untouchable gods. They looked at me as if I were an insect they were about to crush under their designer shoes. I felt the micro drive vibrate once against my palm, signaling the high-speed data extraction was complete. I smoothly slipped it out of the port and concealed it back up my sleeve. I looked at my brother and my sister-in-law. I gave them a chilling, calm smile that made Brock finally hesitate for a fraction of a second. I told them they were absolutely right. I agreed that I was just a simple data clerk, and they were the brilliant masterminds who had thought of everything. I turned around and walked out of the office, leaving them smirking in their stolen luxury. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me, shutting out the sound of their triumphant laughter. I walked past the glaring receptionist and stepped into the waiting elevator. As the doors slid shut, I pulled the silver microdrive from my sleeve. I now held the undeniable digital blueprints of their entire fraudulent empire, including the very loan applications they used to frame me. I walked out of the towering glass building and blended into the crowded Chicago sidewalks. The silver microdrive felt heavy in my pocket, a digital loaded weapon waiting to be fired. I bypassed my mundane downtown apartment and took a train out to an unmarked industrial park in the West Loop. This was the true headquarters of my tech agency, Vanguard Analytics. It was a place my family did not even know existed. To them, I was just a lowly data entry clerk, pushing papers for a logistics firm. They had no idea that I owned a sprawling warehouse filled with state-of-the-art servers and a team of the most brilliant forensic data scientists in the country. Inside the warehouse, the air was cool and filled with the low hum of cooling units. My lead forensic accountant, Marcus, met me at the secure entrance. I handed him the microdrive and instructed him to isolate the data in a completely sterile environment. We moved into the glass-enclosed war room overlooking the server floor. Marcus plugged the drive into an encrypted terminal, and Brock's entire financial life spilled across the massive wall monitors. I initiated a proprietary protocol we called the Shadow Move. It was an aggressive tracking algorithm I had originally designed to catch sophisticated corporate espionage for our high-end clients. Now I was aiming it squarely at my own blood. The software instantly began chewing through Brock's forged loan applications, tracing the routing numbers, IP addresses, and digital signatures. Tanya had been clever. She had routed the stolen funds through a complex web of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. She was a ruthless corporate lawyer playing a programmer's game, but she left digital breadcrumbs everywhere. As the algorithm mapped the flow of the $28 million, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. The stolen money was not just sitting in offshore accounts paying for Tanya's designer wardrobe and Brock's luxury cars. The funds were making a U-turn and coming back into the United States. Marcus pointed at a cluster of transactions hitting several commercial banks in Illinois. Brock and Tanya were not just embezzling money from my father's manufacturing company. They were actively laundering the stolen funds through a sophisticated real estate front right here in the city. They had established a dozen anonymous holding companies using registered agents in Delaware to mask their ownership. Through these dummy corporations, they were aggressively buying up distressed commercial properties across the south side of Chicago. They were wildly overpaying for worthless real estate, pushing the dirty corporate funds into clean escrows and using Tanya's legal firm to rubber stamp the transactions as legitimate acquisitions. They were falsifying renovation invoices and washing the money clean right under Harold's nose. They were simultaneously draining the family manufacturing business of its operating capital and leaving me holding the bag for the toxic debt. If the federal authorities caught wind of this operation, it would not just be a simple bankruptcy case. It would be a massive federal racketeering and money laundering indictment. My social security number and my forged signature were plastered across the origin point of the dirty money. Tanya had meticulously structured the shell companies so that all criminal liability flowed directly upward to the primary guarantor, which was me. They had literally built a financial guillotine and tied the rope securely around my neck. They planned to let me take the fall, leaving me to face decades in a federal penitentiary, while they walked away clean as the wealthy victims of a rogue sister. A cold and calculating fury settled over me. This went far beyond toxic family dynamics and childhood favoritism. This was a deliberate sociopathic attempt to completely destroy my life so they could maintain their illusion of superiority. I looked at Marcus and told him to freeze all automated tracking. I did not want to trigger any security alerts on Tanya's end and let them know their network was fully compromised. Instead, I instructed my team to shift our strategy. I opened a secure line to Mr. Halloway at the Royal Wealth Management Bank. I authorized the immediate deployment of the $50 million from Josephine's liquid trust. I did not just want to block the fraudulent loans. I wanted to own them. I ordered my legal team to quietly buy up the debt of every single shell company Brock and Tanya had created. I was going to surround them financially. By purchasing the commercial mortgages on their laundered properties, I was making myself their primary creditor. They thought they were building a massive, untouchable real estate empire, but they were actually building it entirely inside my cage. Every dollar they washed clean was now legally bound to a mortgage that I personally controlled. Just as Marcus began executing the silent acquisitions and transferring the commercial deeds into my holding company, my secure private phone buzzed on the glass table. It was an incoming email, an automated blast sent to the high society mailing list of Chicago. It was a list I monitored closely for corporate intelligence and networking events. The subject line caught my eye immediately, making my blood run cold. It was an exclusive invitation to the Wilson family legacy auction. I opened the digital flyer and stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. Brock and Beatrice were hosting an extravagant invite-only gala at the family estate next weekend. The manufacturing business was clearly hemorrhaging cash faster than Brock could launder it, and the forged loans were not covering their immediate operating expenses. They needed instant, untraceable liquidity to appease a group of aggressive local creditors who were threatening to seize the factory assets. To cover their tracks and keep the illusion of wealth alive, my family was liquidating assets. But they were not selling their luxury cars, their country club memberships, or Tanya's ridiculous jewelry collection. The glossy digital flyer prominently featured high-resolution photos of antique art, rare first-edition books, and vintage heirloom jewelry. It was Grandma Josephine's private collection. My parents had raided the guest house while Josephine was vulnerable. They had stolen her most prized personal possessions and were planning to auction off her entire life history to the highest bidder just to save their own miserable skins. I was still staring at the glowing screen, my vision blurring with absolute rage at the sight of my grandmother's stolen treasures, when a sharp, frantic knocking rattled my apartment door. I minimized the auction flyer on my encrypted monitor, locked the terminal, and walked down the short hallway. Looking through the peephole, I saw my mother, Beatrice. She was pacing the narrow corridor, her usually immaculate blonde hair slightly windblown, her posture rigid with tension. I unlocked the deadbolt, and she pushed past me without a single word of greeting. She stood in the center of my modest living room, her eyes darting around the space with thinly veiled disgust. She took in the second-hand sofa, the simple bookshelf, and the small television, clearly unable to fathom how a woman sitting on $50 million could live in such an average space. She did not bother taking off her coat. She simply turned to me, extended her open palm, and demanded the check. She told me Mr. Caldwell at the Royal Wealth Management Bank had completely stonewalled their legal team, But Jamal had used his contacts to confirm that the funds had been transferred to a private holding account in my name. Beatrice's voice trembled with a mixture of panic and aggressive entitlement. She ordered me to wire the $50 million back into the primary family trust immediately. She adopted a tone of manufactured maternal concern, stepping closer and lowering her voice. She said we needed to keep the family together during a stressful transition. She claimed your brother Brock made a few minor miscalculations with the commercial accounts, and the manufacturing business just needs a temporary cash injection to weather the storm. She told me I was not equipped to handle that level of wealth and that the adults needed the capital to save my father's legacy. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or defend my right to my own inheritance. I simply walked over to my desk, picked up the thick stack of freshly printed financial dossiers I had extracted from Brock's local servers and dropped them onto the coffee table right in front of her. The heavy thud of the paper made her flinch. I told her the family business did not need a temporary cash injection. I told her the company was already a rotting corpse, and her golden boy had been the one to slaughter it. Beatrice stared at me, her eyes narrowing. I instructed her to look at the top page. I stood over her as she reluctantly looked down at the highlighted bank statements, the offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of her son's criminal enterprise. I laid out the cold, hard facts. I explained that Brock and Jamal had saddled the family business with $28 million in toxic debt. I showed her the paper trail proving they had laundered the stolen cash through Southside real estate shell companies. I pointed directly to the forged signatures on the loan applications, explaining that they were perfectly prepared to let the entire manufacturing empire implode, while framing me for the federal embezzlement charges. I watched my mother's eyes scan the digital receipts, the undeniable blueprints of Brock's sociopathic greed. For a fraction of a second, I saw the terrifying reality register on her face. I saw the horrifying understanding that her favorite child was a ruthless criminal willing to send his own sister to federal prison to protect his luxury cars. But then the cognitive dissonance took over. The defensive walls of her lifelong delusion slammed into place. Instead of horror at what her son had done, her face twisted with a familiar, vicious fury. She violently swiped her hand across the coffee table, shoving the stack of papers off the edge and scattering the damning evidence across my rug. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest, her voice pitching into a shrill scream. She accused me of forging the documents myself. She called me a manipulative liar who had spent hours fabricating digital files just to smear my brother's good name. She screamed that I was jealous and vindictive. She said I had spent my entire miserable life resenting Brock's towering ambition and Penelope's perfect wealthy marriage. She claimed Brock was a financial visionary engaged in creative corporate restructuring that my pathetic data entry clerk brain was simply too ignorant to comprehend. Beatrice told me I was a bitter, lonely failure who was inventing wild, psychotic conspiracies just to watch my own family suffer. She demanded the $50 million again, threatening to have Jamal sue me for defamation and elder abuse if I did not surrender the money to save the family name. I stood perfectly still, letting her venomous words wash over me without absorbing a single drop. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at me with absolute contempt. As she reached for her designer handbag to storm out of the apartment, her shaking hands fumbled the clasp. The bag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the floor and spilling its contents across the hardwood. Alongside her expensive lipstick, her platinum credit cards, and her car keys, a thick cream-colored legal envelope slid out. The wax seal was broken. I saw the bold red letterhead of Jamal's elite law firm stamped across the top. Before Beatrice could bend down to snatch it up, I stepped forward and pinned the edge of the envelope under my shoe. She gasped, telling me to get away from her private property. I ignored her, reaching down and pulling the heavy document free from the envelope. I unfolded the crisp legal paper, my eyes scanning the heavily drafted text. It was not a bank injunction, it was an expedited, mercilessly drafted eviction notice. But it was not for a commercial tenant or a warehouse. The notice was explicitly addressed to Josephine. Beatrice snatched her empty handbag from the floor, her face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. She did not even attempt to deny it. She straightened her spine, her aristocratic arrogance returning in full force. She sneered at me, stating coldly that the guest house occupied an acre of prime real estate on the family compound. She said with the current cash flow issues, they absolutely could not afford to let a senile, useless old woman occupy a property they were listing for immediate demolition and commercial redevelopment by the end of the week. I stared at my mother as the truth hung in the air. She was actually going to throw her own 82-year-old woman onto the street to make room for a bulldozer. I did not yell. I simply picked up Beatrice's designer handbag from the floor, shoved the eviction notice back inside, and handed it to her. I told her to get out of my apartment and never come back. Beatrice snatched the bag, warning me that Jamal would destroy me by the end of the week. She slammed the door so hard the walls shook. I did not waste a single second. I checked the time. It was early evening. Arthur had warned me that Jamal planned to arrive at the estate tomorrow morning with a police escort and a fake psychiatric hold. I had less than 12 hours to pull off an extraction. I grabbed my coat and called the private security contractor I had retained earlier that day. I ordered them to meet me at the service entrance of my parents' estate in exactly 40 minutes. Then I called Caldwell at the Royal Wealth Management Bank. I authorized an immediate wire transfer to secure the penthouse suite at the Sovereign. The Sovereign was the most exclusive high-security luxury assisted living facility in the state. It catered exclusively to retired politicians, CEOs, and elite figures who required absolute privacy and 24-hour specialized medical care. It was a fortress of marble and glass, and it was the one place Jamal could not penetrate with his local legal connections. When I arrived at my parents' estate, the sun had just set. The main house was brightly lit, completely oblivious to my presence. My security team, 4 imposing men in dark suits, moved with military precision. We bypassed the main gates and went straight to the guest house, hidden behind the overgrown hedges. I used my old spare key to unlock the door. Josephine was sitting in her favorite armchair, reading a book under a warm reading lamp. She looked up and smiled, completely unsurprised by my sudden arrival or the 4 massive security guards flanking me. She simply closed her book, adjusted her glasses, and asked if it was time to go. I told her it was. She had already packed a single vintage leather suitcase. She knew the storm was coming. We escorted her out through the service gate and into a waiting armored SUV. By the time my parents or Brock realized she was gone, she would be completely untouchable. We drove straight to the Sovereign. The facility director met us in the grand lobby, treating Josephine like absolute royalty. Her suite was breathtaking, featuring panoramic views of the city's skyline, a private garden terrace, and a dedicated nursing staff on standby. I sat with Josephine on her plush velvet sofa and promised her she would never be treated like a burden again. She squeezed my hand, her eyes sharp and clear. She told me she knew I was the only one strong enough to hold the line. The next morning, I did not go to my logistics job. I established a command center in the private business lounge at the Sovereign. My New York legal team flew in on a red-eye flight. They arrived alongside Dr. Eris Thorne, the elite geriatric neurologist I had hired. Dr. Thorne spent 3 hours conducting a rigorous, comprehensive cognitive evaluation of Josephine. His conclusion was definitive and legally bulletproof. Josephine possessed full mental capacity, 0 signs of dementia, and absolute lucidity. With Dr. Thorne's sworn affidavit in hand, my lawyers immediately filed for emergency protective guardianship in federal court, completely bypassing Jamal's corrupt local judges. Within hours, a federal judge signed the order. I was granted irrevocable medical and legal proxy over Josephine. I was reviewing the final guardianship decrees when the heavy glass doors of the business lounge swung open. The facility director stepped in looking visibly flustered. He apologized, saying there was a disturbance in the lobby. Before he could explain further, Tanya shoved past him. She marched into the lounge wearing a sharp crimson suit, her heels striking the marble floor like weapons. 2 facility security guards followed closely behind, trying to ask her to lower her voice. Tanya ignored them, her eyes locking onto me with pure, unadulterated venom. She slammed a stack of legal documents onto the conference table. She demanded that the facility release Josephine into her custody immediately. She announced to the entire room that she was a senior partner at the most powerful law firm in the city and threatened to sue the sovereign into bankruptcy if they did not comply. She claimed I had kidnapped a severely mentally ill woman and that she had a signed court order from a local judge demanding Josephine's transfer to a state psychiatric ward. I remained seated, calmly sipping my coffee. I signaled for the facility security to step back. I looked at Tanya and told her she was out of her jurisdiction. Tanya scoffed, leaning over the table to try and intimidate me. She said her jurisdiction was wherever she decided it was. She told me my little rescue mission was over and ordered me to produce the old woman before she had me arrested for elder abduction. I did not argue. I simply slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. It was the federal guardianship decree stamped, sealed, and signed by a federal judge just 2 hours ago. I watched Tanya's eyes dart across the document. I saw the exact moment her legal brain processed the absolute authority of that federal seal. Her local bribe judge's order was instantly rendered completely worthless. I was the supreme legal guardian. Tanya had absolutely zero authority to even speak to Josephine, let alone remove her from the premises. I stood up, leveling my gaze with hers. I told Tanya to take her fraudulent papers and get out of my sight before I had the guards throw her out for trespassing. I reminded her that every single camera in the facility was currently recording her unhinged behavior, which would look fantastic when I filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association regarding her harassment of a protected senior citizen. Tanya's face flushed dark red. Her jaw tightened so hard I thought her teeth might crack. She snatched her useless documents from the table, realizing she had been completely outmaneuvered. But Tanya was not the type to retreat quietly. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her voice dropping to a vicious, calculating whisper. She told me I might have won the paperwork battle today, but I had absolutely no idea who I was dealing with. She said if I wanted to play hardball, she would absolutely destroy my life. Tanya promised that by tomorrow morning, she would have her media contacts launch a massive smear campaign on every local news network in the state. She swore to paint me as a manipulative, greedy sociopath who kidnapped her own grandmother to steal the family fortune, guaranteeing that I would be publicly crucified before the week was over. True to her word, Tanya did not waste a single second. By Monday morning, my face was plastered across the digital front pages of every local news outlet and high society gossip column in Chicago. The headlines were ruthless and meticulously crafted to destroy my reputation. They called me a rogue sister and a desperate, greedy outcast who had abducted her own vulnerable grandmother in a sick ploy to extort the family manufacturing empire. Tanya had leveraged every single connection her elite law firm possessed to feed the press a fabricated narrative. They aired sound bites from Beatrice, who stood on the steps of the family estate, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, weeping to local reporters about how terrified she was for poor, confused Josephine. My secure private phone vibrated off the glass conference table at Vanguard Analytics. Marcus, my lead forensic accountant, walked into the room, carrying a tablet displaying the morning broadcast. He muted the screen and looked at me, asking if we needed to deploy our crisis management team to issue a cease and desist. He had a drafted press release ready to go, complete with Dr. Thorne's medical evaluation proving Josephine was in perfect health and acting under her own free will. I shook my head and told Marcus to kill the press release. I did not want to interrupt my family while they were making a mistake. The louder Tanya and Beatrice screamed to the press, the more desperate they looked to the financial sector. Let them control the local morning news. I was about to take control of their entire reality. I turned my attention away from the television monitors and back to the sprawling digital blueprint of my father's corporate empire. Harold's primary holding company, Wilson Global Industries, was the financial umbrella that controlled the manufacturing plants, the equipment leases, and the commercial real estate they operated out of. For decades, it had been a fortress. But Brock's rampant embezzlement and his disastrous foray into Southside money laundering had severely compromised the company's liquidity. My algorithms had been running non-stop all weekend, mapping the exact stress points in Harold's financial architecture. I found the fatal flaw buried deep in a mezzanine debt structure. 4 years ago, to finance a massive expansion of the manufacturing line, Harold had taken out a highly leveraged commercial loan package. The primary creditor was Apex Capital, a mid-tier institutional lender based in New York. Because Brock had been draining the operating accounts to cover his toxic shell companies, Wilson Global Industries had violated 3 critical liquidity covenants with Apex Capital in the last 45 days. Harold was technically in default. Apex Capital was quietly preparing to restructure the debt, but they were nervous. They wanted the liability off their books before the manufacturing sector caught wind of the instability. I looked at Marcus and authorized the kill shot. I instructed him to contact Apex Capital directly through a blinded Vanguard corporate proxy. We were going to offer to buy the entire Wilson Global Industries debt portfolio at a premium, paying entirely in cash. Marcus did not hesitate. He understood exactly what I was building. He walked back onto the server floor and began routing the massive capital reserves we had legally secured from Josephine's $50 million liquid trust. We were executing a hostile debt acquisition, moving with the speed and silence of a digital assassin. Because we were paying cash and absorbing all the institutional risk, Apex Capital did not ask questions. The executives in New York were thrilled to dump the toxic asset. Over the next 6 hours, while Tanya was busy giving another tearful interview to a local radio station about my supposed mental instability, the financial bedrock of her entire existence was quietly shifting beneath her feet. The lawyers at Vanguard Analytics reviewed the master promissory notes, the collateral agreements, and the personal guarantees. The transfer of the debt portfolio was executed flawlessly. By mid-afternoon, the digital ink was dry. Apex Capital was completely removed from the equation. My private holding company, operating under an anonymous corporate veil, was now the sole owner of Harold's primary operating debt. I sat in the glass-enclosed war room and projected the final collateral agreements onto the massive wall monitors. The sheer scale of my father's arrogance was staggering. To secure the original loans from Apex Capital, Harold had not just pledged the factory equipment and the commercial warehouses, he had crossed a massive red line. He had used the family estate, the sprawling suburban compound where Beatrice currently slept, as cross-collateral to guarantee the corporate notes. They had put the roof over their own heads on the chopping block to fund their illusion of absolute power. And now, I held the axe. I read through the specific acceleration clauses embedded in the loan contract. Since Brock had already breached the liquidity covenants, I had the legal right to accelerate the loan immediately. That meant I could demand payment in full for the entire outstanding principal balance within 72 hours. If Harold failed to produce $32 million in cash by the end of the week, I could legally seize the manufacturing plants, liquidate the equipment, and foreclose on the family estate. I was no longer just the scapegoat daughter or the rogue sister. I was their master creditor. I was the bank. I owned the walls around them, the ground beneath them, and the very air they breathed in their arrogant, mahogany-lined offices. I instructed Marcus to draft the formal notice of default and the acceleration demand. I wanted it printed on heavy premium legal stock and delivered directly to Harold's private office by a bonded courier. I wanted him to feel the physical weight of his own destruction. But before Marcus could even finalize the delivery protocol, my secure phone lit up again. The caller ID flashed a number I had not seen on my personal line in nearly 5 years. It was my father. Harold had never called me during work hours. He had never considered my time valuable enough to warrant a direct phone call, unless he needed me to run a mundane errand or absorb the blame for one of Brock's administrative failures. The fact that he was calling my personal cell phone meant the media circus Tanya created had finally breached his insulated executive suite. He was calling to put the disgraced daughter back in her place. I signaled for Marcus to pause the courier dispatch. I wanted to hear the exact tone of my father's voice. I wanted to listen to his arrogant demands one last time before the ground fell out from under him. I pressed a button on the console and routed the call through the war room speakers, recording the audio to our secure servers. I answered the call with a calm, perfectly leveled voice. Harold did not say hello. He did not ask how I was. He erupted through the speakers with a furious, booming roar. He demanded to know what kind of psychotic game I thought I was playing. He screamed that the board of directors was demanding answers about the news reports and that my pathetic attention-seeking stunt was damaging the corporate brand. He ordered me to bring Josephine back to the estate immediately and turn myself into the local police for a psychiatric evaluation before he let Tanya press federal kidnapping charges. He commanded me to fix the mess I had made, completely unaware that he was screaming at the person who was about to foreclose on his entire life. I let him rage until his breath ran short and his voice cracked into a pathetic wheeze. When the threats of local police and federal kidnapping charges failed to elicit so much as a sigh from my end of the line, Harold realized his intimidation tactics were entirely useless. The blustering corporate tyrant abruptly shifted his strategy. His tone dropped an octave, adopting the patronizing synthetic warmth he reserved for pacifying nervous shareholders. He told me we needed to stop this ridiculous feuding. He proposed a family reconciliation dinner at the estate that evening to calmly discuss Josephine's trust and find a reasonable compromise that protected everyone. I smiled at the glowing monitors of my Vanguard Analytics command center. I told my father I would be there at 8. I drove my modest sedan through the towering iron gates of the Wilson family compound. The sprawling manicured lawns and the massive stone facade of the main house looked exactly the same as they had during my miserable childhood. But my perspective had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the outcast daughter pulling into a driveway where I was not wanted. I was the apex creditor inspecting my newly acquired collateral. Every stone, every luxury vehicle parked in the circular driveway, and every crystal chandelier glowing through the massive windows now legally answered to me. I was escorted into the formal dining room. Harold sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Beatrice sat to his right, wearing her finest pearls and a strained, artificial smile. Brock and Tanya occupied the opposite side, looking like two apex predators, waiting for a wounded gazelle to bleed out. They had not prepared a feast. There was only a single bottle of expensive wine and an empty crystal glass set at my place. This was not a dinner, it was a tribunal. I sat down and placed my phone face down on the table, the high-definition recording application silently running. Harold began the negotiation with a masterful display of gaslighting. He told me they were willing to forgive my erratic behavior and the massive public embarrassment I had caused the family. Beatrice chimed in, claiming they understood I was simply overwhelmed by the responsibility of Josephine's care. Tanya then slid a thick, legally binding contract across the polished wood. She explained that the document would formally transfer my medical and financial guardianship of Josephine back to Harold. In exchange, Brock offered a magnanimous concession. He promised to allocate a generous 5% of the trust's liquid assets to a restricted account in my name, provided I signed a sweeping non-disclosure agreement. I did not touch the pen. Instead, I leaned back and looked directly at my brother. I played the role of the hesitant, confused clerk perfectly. I asked Brock how he planned to salvage the manufacturing company's liquidity if he locked up Josephine's trust in corporate escrow. I feigned ignorance, asking how he could possibly manage the massive commercial loans when the operating accounts were completely drained. Brock could not resist the bait. His sociopathic need to prove his superior intellect overrode every basic instinct of legal self-preservation. He let out a condescending laugh, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He openly mocked my lack of financial literacy. He leaned across the table and explicitly detailed his genius strategy. Brock bragged about utilizing decentralized holding companies in Delaware to route capital through Southside real estate developments. He proudly explained how he inflated renovation invoices to wash corporate funds clean, effectively creating a self-sustaining liquidity loop that the Internal Revenue Service was too bureaucratic to catch. Tanya smiled proudly, adding that her legal firm had structured the shell corporations with absolute anonymity, ensuring that all federal liability was shielded from the primary board of directors. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they did not realize they had just handed me a recorded detailed confession of systemic money laundering, wire fraud, and federal racketeering. They had meticulously outlined their entire criminal enterprise on a silver platter. I reached across the table, picked up the fraudulent guardianship surrender contract, and calmly folded it into thirds. I slipped it into my blazer pocket to add to my mountain of physical evidence. I looked at the four of them, memorizing the smug satisfaction radiating from their faces. I thanked them for the enlightening conversation. I told them I would not be signing anything, and that I would see them all very soon. Beatrice slammed her hand on the table, her artificial warmth instantly vanishing. She screamed that I was an ungrateful, stupid girl walking away from the only lifeline they would ever offer. Harold stood up, his face flushing purple, shouting that he would crush me in court and leave me bankrupt. I did not flinch. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room, the sound of their furious threats echoing off the marble floors. They believed they had won the psychological war. They had absolutely no idea that the executioner's blade was already dropping. I climbed into my car and locked the doors, retrieving my phone to save the encrypted audio file to my secure servers. Just as I put the vehicle in drive, my private Vanguard analytics line rang. The incoming caller ID displayed heavy encryption, routing a protocol specifically designed to bypass corporate espionage tracking. I answered the call. The voice on the other end was trembling, completely stripped of composure. It was Richard Sterling, the primary angel investor and board member who had initially backed Brock's massive manufacturing expansion. Richard sounded terrified, his breathing shallow and erratic. He told me he knew who I really was. He knew Vanguard Analytics was quietly mapping the toxic debt and tracking the offshore accounts. He said he had just discovered Brock's shadow ledgers and realized the entire executive board was about to face massive federal indictments. Richard begged me for immunity. He offered to flip on my father, my brother, and Tanya, promising to hand over the unredacted master hard drives of the entire criminal operation if I guaranteed him a way out of the impending bloodbath. I told Richard to meet me in exactly 1 hour at the subterranean parking structure beneath the Vanguard Analytics building. I instructed him to come alone, leave his cell phone in his car, and bring every piece of physical evidence he possessed. I did not offer him a guarantee of immunity. I simply told him his absolute transparency was his only chance to survive the impending legal massacre. I ended the call and ordered Marcus to prepare the secure air-gapped decryption lab. The parking garage was echoing and damp, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. I stood flanked by two of my imposing security contractors as Richard's sleek black Mercedes pulled into the concrete bay. The man who stepped out of the driver's seat was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant angel investor who used to drink expensive scotch in my father's study. Richard was sweating profusely, his custom-tailored suit hanging off his shrinking frame. He clutched a reinforced titanium briefcase to his chest. His eyes darted toward the shadows, visibly terrified that Brock had sent someone to follow him. Richard handed over the briefcase with shaking hands, his voice cracked as he confessed the horrifying truth. He told me the situation was infinitely darker than fraudulent commercial loans and real estate shell games. He realized Brock and Tanya were setting him up to take the fall for massive federal violations, and he was ready to burn them to the ground to save himself. He explained that Brock's aggressive embezzlement had completely starved the primary manufacturing plants of their vital operating capital. To hide the massive cash deficits from the lower-level shareholders, Brock and Harold had quietly suspended all mandatory safety maintenance and hazard compliance protocols across their 5 largest factories. Richard revealed the true sickening cost of my family's greed. They were forcing their blue-collar employees to operate severely degraded heavy machinery. They had bypassed critical ventilation upgrades in the chemical processing wings, actively exposing hundreds of workers to highly toxic industrial solvents. Workers were already reporting severe respiratory issues and chemical burns. When terrified factory managers filed internal safety complaints, Tanya deployed her elite law firm to crush them. She intimidated the workers into silence using aggressive non-disclosure agreements and threats of immediate termination, threatening to strip them of their pensions and health care. They were literally trading human lives and worker safety to cover the millions Brock had stolen for his luxury lifestyle. A wave of absolute disgust washed over me, cold and hard. For my entire life, Harold had stood at the head of the dining table during holiday dinners, delivering pompous, self-righteous speeches about how Wilson Global Industries was a family. He preached endlessly about corporate loyalty, claiming he took personal care of the working-class men and women who built his empire. Meanwhile, behind the mahogany doors of his executive suite, he was actively poisoning them to maintain his illusion of aristocratic superiority. My family was not just financially corrupt, they were morally bankrupt. I took the heavy metal briefcase from Richard. I told him my legal team would review the depth of his cooperation. But I made it very clear that if a single worker was fatally injured because of his silence, I would personally hand him over to the district attorney. I left him standing alone in the cold concrete garage and took the private elevator straight up to the Vanguard Analytics server floor. Marcus was waiting in the glass-enclosed war room. He unlocked the briefcase and plugged Richard's master solid-state drives into our isolated terminal. The decryption software tore through the firewalls in less than 20 minutes. A sprawling labyrinth of hidden corporate emails suppressed safety inspection reports, and illegal payoff ledgers spilled across the massive wall monitors. Tanya had been incredibly sloppy. She believed her elite legal privilege protected her communications, so she had openly discussed bribing state regulators to ignore the failing ventilation systems over unsecured channels. I instructed Marcus to run a targeted search algorithm through the encrypted email archives, cross-referencing Brock's offshore wire transfers with the dates of the suppressed factory safety reports. As the software processed the massive data dump, a highly classified chain of internal emails emerged. It was a direct thread from exactly 3 months ago. The subject line was marked urgent and highly confidential. It was an email from the chief engineer at the South Side plant detailing a critical structural failure in one of the high-pressure chemical vats. The engineer warned that the equipment was operating past its breaking point and posed an immediate lethal threat to the entire warehouse floor. He stated clearly that a rupture would result in catastrophic chemical exposure. He begged for emergency funds to replace the unit before a blowout occurred. I pulled up the subsequent replies. Brock had forwarded the engineer's frantic warning directly to Tanya and Harold. Brock complained that replacing the massive vat would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and expose their drained operating accounts to the board of directors. Tanya legally advised that replacing the machinery would trigger an automatic state inspection, which would subsequently uncover their other ventilation violations and shut down the plant. Then I opened the final email in the chain. It was sent from Harold's personal private server. My father had explicitly ordered Brock to ignore the engineer, bury the hazard report, and authorize a $50,000 bribe to a local compliance officer to forge a passing safety grade. Harold had knowingly signed off on a lethal safety failure just to protect his own pride and hide his son's theft. I stared at the digitized signature on the final email, the damning proof of my father's sociopathy glowing against the dark monitors of the war room. Harold had not just turned a blind eye to Brock's staggering incompetence. He had actively orchestrated a cover-up that put hundreds of innocent lives in imminent danger. I instructed Marcus to lock down the entire data dump on our highest security servers, isolating the drive behind military-grade encryption protocols. We possessed the nuclear code to destroy Wilson Global Industries, but I was not going to detonate it just yet. Dropping the evidence directly to the authorities would trigger a swift federal raid, wrapping the entire scandal in bureaucratic red tape. I wanted my family to feel the psychological terror of their impending ruin. I wanted them to look up and see the blades suspended over their heads. I needed a specific kind of pressure, a relentless localized heat that would force them into making careless mistakes. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed a number I had kept archived for nearly a decade. Claire Kensington was currently the senior investigative producer for Chicago's most aggressive independent news network. Years ago, before my family successfully branded me as a volatile outcast, Claire and I had shared a cramped dormitory during our undergraduate studies. She was razor sharp, relentlessly ambitious, and possessed a deeply ingrained hatred for corporate corruption. She had watched from the sidelines as my father and sister systematically dismantled my reputation. When she answered the phone, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told her I had a story that would make her career, and I needed to meet her in person immediately. We met at a dimly lit cash-only diner on the outskirts of the industrial district, far away from the polished mahogany and valet parking of my family's usual haunts. Claire slid into the cracked vinyl booth, her eyes scanning my face with sharp professional curiosity. She had seen the morning broadcast, the vicious smear campaign Tanya had launched against me regarding Josephine's guardianship. Claire asked me straight out if I was finally ready to fight back. I slid a plain manila folder across the sticky laminate table. I did not give her the explosive emails from Harold's private server. I did not give her the undeniable proof of the $50,000 bribe. I gave her breadcrumbs. Inside the folder were redacted safety inspection schedules, public records of standard compliance renewals, and a list of specific highly technical questions regarding the ventilation systems at the Southside manufacturing plant. I also included the name of the local compliance officer who had miraculously signed off on the facility's safety grade despite a complete lack of required maintenance logs. I was handing her a treasure map with the final destination obscured. I told Claire to start asking questions. I instructed her to send her most aggressive reporters to the Southside plant and have them start poking around the chemical processing wings. I told her to pull the public permits and demand on-the-record interviews with the safety foreman about the high-pressure vats. Claire looked at the documents and then back at me, her journalistic instincts flaring. She asked if I had the smoking gun. She wanted the final piece of the puzzle that tied the safety violations directly to the executive board. I took a sip of my black coffee and smiled. I told her the smoking gun was secured, but she had to lay the groundwork first. I needed the Wilson Global corporate office to know that the press was actively digging into their darkest secret. I wanted my father and brother to wake up every single morning, wondering if today was the day the headlines shifted from my supposed mental instability to their lethal negligence. The threat of exposure was a magnificent weapon. It was a sword of Damocles hanging by a fraying thread, and I was going to let them sweat underneath it. Claire did not hesitate. She grabbed the folder, her eyes alight with the thrill of the hunt. She promised the inquiries would begin before the end of the business day. The impact was immediate and spectacular. By early Tuesday morning, the internal communication channels at Wilson Global Industries were lighting up like a compromised power grid. Marcus intercepted panicked text messages, flying between Brock and the plant managers. Claire's reporting team had shown up at the Southside facility with cameras demanding to see the ventilation maintenance logs. They were ambushing mid-level executives in the parking lot, asking highly specific, terrifying questions about the structural integrity of the chemical vats. The psychological warfare was executing flawlessly. Harold could no longer focus on the hostile debt acquisition or the media circus Tanya had orchestrated. He was entirely consumed by the sudden aggressive media interest in the exact safety hazard he had personally ordered buried. The fortress was cracking from the inside out. My family was bleeding out on multiple fronts, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of concurrent crises. But Tanya was a different breed of predator. While Harold and Brock panicked over the investigative reporters, my sister remained hyper-focused on the financial guillotine resting on their necks. She knew the media scandal meant nothing if they lost control of the holding company and the family estate. The 72-hour acceleration demand on their corporate debt was ticking down, and Tanya was desperate to uncover the identity of the anonymous holding company that had bought their loans from Apex Capital. She needed a target to sue, a face to attack. Her arrogance drove her to make a fatal miscalculation. She bypassed the standard legal channels entirely. Our surveillance feeds picked up the movement late Tuesday afternoon. Tanya drove her silver Porsche to the private underground parking garage of the First National Bank of Chicago. She was not there to conduct standard corporate business. She had arranged a clandestine meeting with Arthur Halloway, the senior executive bank manager, who handled the escrow accounts for the original Apex Capital loans. Halloway was a notorious opportunist, a man who valued his offshore accounts far more than his fiduciary duties. Marcus tapped into the garage's security cameras and synchronized the audio feeds. We watched from the war room as Tanya stepped out of her vehicle, her face a mask of cold desperation. She approached Halloway, completely dropping the polished, ethical facade of an elite corporate attorney. Tanya demanded the unredacted transfer documents. She needed the exact routing numbers and corporate registry of the entity that had purchased their debt. When Halloway cited strict confidentiality clauses and banking regulations, Tanya did not argue the law. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. She shoved it into Halloway's chest, her voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls. She told him there was $200,000 in untraceable cash inside the envelope, with another $300,000 waiting if he handed over the identity of their new creditor. Halloway looked down at the thick manila envelope pressed against his tailored suit. He did not immediately reach for it. Instead, he let his eyes dart nervously toward the shadowy corners of the subterranean garage, playing the role of a terrified but greedy financial executive to absolute perfection. What Tanya did not know was that Vanguard Analytics had already paid Arthur Halloway a visit the previous evening. Marcus had presented the bank manager with a meticulously compiled dossier of his own offshore tax evasion schemes. Halloway had been given a very simple choice. He could either cooperate completely with our surveillance operation, or he could spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. He had wisely chosen the former, standing in the cold concrete bay. Halloway hesitated exactly as he had been instructed. He told Tanya the risk was astronomical. He reminded her that handing over the unredacted corporate registry of a major institutional debt buyer would trigger an automatic internal audit. He stammered, claiming that if the compliance department caught him leaking classified fiduciary data, he would lose his career and face federal prosecution. Tanya rolled her eyes, her lips curling into a vicious sneer. She had zero respect for the man standing in front of her. In her elite, privileged mind, everyone had a price, and anyone who hesitated was simply begging for a higher bid. She took a step closer, invading his personal space, her designer heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She told him to drop the pathetic ethical act. She explicitly demanded the exact limited liability company name, the primary routing numbers, and the authorized legal signatory on the Apex Capital debt acquisition. She shoved the envelope harder against his chest. Halloway swallowed hard and took the cash. He asked her to verbally confirm the exact terms of their arrangement, claiming he needed absolute assurance before he accessed the restricted banking mainframe. Tanya's arrogance blinded her to the trap closing around her ankles. She spoke loudly and clearly, her voice bouncing off the concrete pillars directly into our synchronized directional microphones. She stated without a shadow of a doubt that she was paying him a $200,000 cash retainer right now to breach federal banking privacy laws. She mapped out the precise money laundering protocol she would use to wire the remaining $300,000 into a dummy account of his choosing the moment the unredacted creditor file was in her hands. She even threw in a threat promising that if he took her money and failed to deliver the documents, she would use her law firm to bury him in endless, ruinous litigation. Inside the glass-enclosed war room at Vanguard Analytics, Marcus tapped a single key on his console. The digital audio waveform on the massive wall monitor locked into place, glowing a brilliant, solid green. The transcription software instantly generated a perfect time-stamped transcript of the entire exchange. I stared at the screen with absolute satisfaction. Tanya had just handed me her entire existence. I now possessed undeniable high-definition audio and video evidence of a senior partner at a top-tier corporate law firm actively engaging in commercial bribery, criminal conspiracy, and federal wire fraud. She had effectively surrendered her law license, her freedom, and her carefully cultivated reputation. The invincible golden child of the Wilson family was now a documented felon. I instructed Marcus to sever the feed. Holloway handed Tanya a sealed folder containing a maze of useless, heavily redacted dummy corporations we had generated to keep her chasing ghosts. Tanya snatched the folder, turned on her heel, and sped out of the garage, completely unaware that she had just signed her own professional death warrant. While Tanya was busy destroying her life in a bank basement, her brother was rapidly losing his mind inside the executive suite of Wilson Global Industries. The situation at the manufacturing plants had escalated from a controlled crisis into a full-blown operational catastrophe. Claire's investigative team had refused to back down. They had successfully cornered a mid-level safety foreman in the parking lot of the South Side facility and shoved a microphone in his face. The panicked employee, terrified of being held personally liable for the toxic ventilation systems, broke down on camera. He admitted that corporate leadership had routinely ignored their emergency hazard requests. The footage was currently looping on every local news network. The corporate switchboard was locked in a state of continuous gridlock. Furious shareholders were demanding emergency meetings, and key logistics vendors were threatening to suspend all supply chain deliveries until the safety allegations were cleared. Brock was barricaded inside his corner office, the heavy mahogany doors locked from the inside. His tailored suit jacket lay discarded on the floor. He was sweating profusely, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. The media circus was bad enough, but the 72-hour acceleration demand on the $32 million corporate debt was the true nightmare. The deadline was rapidly approaching, and the company operating accounts were still completely drained from his massive embezzlement schemes. He could not wait for Tanya to decipher the redacted banking files. He needed to know exactly who was holding the axe over his neck, so he could beg for an extension or attempt a desperate backroom negotiation. Brock bypassed his sister's legal channels entirely. He booted up his encrypted laptop and reached out to a black market forensic data broker he kept on heavy retainer for his Southside money laundering operations. Brock wired the broker an exorbitant emergency fee, demanding he trace the digital footprint of the massive cash transfer that had cleared the Apex Capital ledgers. For 3 agonizing hours, Brock sat alone in his office, watching his father's legacy burn on the television screens while he waited for the data broker to crack the financial proxy walls. Finally, a secure, heavily encrypted file materialized on Brock's private desktop. He clicked it open with trembling fingers. The document bypassed the nested shell companies and the Delaware-registered proxies, drilling straight down through the financial architecture to expose the primary fiduciary signatory. The screen refreshed, pulling the ultimate beneficial owner of the massive debt portfolio out of the shadows. Brock stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face as his eyes locked onto the glowing text. The entity holding the $32 million debt, the supreme creditor with the absolute legal authority to seize the factories, liquidate the equipment, and foreclose on the Wilson family estate, was not a rival manufacturing conglomerate. It was not a ruthless New York hedge fund. The name staring back at him in stark, undeniable black and white was Elise. Brock threw his encrypted laptop across the room. The sleek metal casing smashed into the mahogany bookshelves, showering the expensive Persian rug with shattered glass and plastic, but the damage to his reality was already absolute. The name burned into his retinas. Elise. The sister they had mocked, exiled, and systematically underestimated was the phantom entity holding the $32 million guillotine over their heads. She was not a struggling outcast. She was the apex predator they had unknowingly invited into their own slaughterhouse. He did not bother picking up his ruined jacket. He sprinted out of the executive suite, ignoring the frantic questions of his administrative staff, and drove his sports car recklessly toward the family compound. He shattered every speed limit, his mind fracturing under the weight of the impending collapse. At the estate, Harold and Beatrice were already in a state of high alert. The local news was playing on every television in the house, looping the damning footage of the terrified safety foreman confessing to the toxic ventilation cover-up. Beatrice was pacing the marble foyer, clutching her pearls and demanding her assistants get the governor on the phone. Harold was screaming into his headset, firing public relations firms as fast as he hired them, completely unaware that the media scandal was merely a distraction. Brock kicked the heavy front doors open and shoved past the terrified housekeeping staff. He dragged his father into the private study and locked the doors. When Brock delivered the news, Harold actually laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound of pure, concentrated denial. He called his son a hysterical fool. He insisted it was a mathematical impossibility. Elise was a nobody. She was a renegade daughter with no corporate backing, incapable of executing a hostile debt acquisition of that magnitude. Brock grabbed his father by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, his voice breaking into a panicked shriek. He screamed that Vanguard Analytics had fronted the capital and Elise was the sole signatory. She owned the debt. She owned the factories. She owned the ground beneath their feet and the very house they were standing in. The color drained from Harold's face. The booming, untouchable patriarch of the Wilson family collapsed into his leather wingback chair, his lungs suddenly struggling to pull in air. Beatrice, who had been listening at the door, burst into the study. She began crying hysterically, refusing to accept that the daughter she had deemed a social pariah now held the keys to her absolute ruin. But Brock was a survivor driven by pure sociopathic self-interest. He knew they had less than 48 hours before my acceleration demand matured. If they could not produce the $32 million in cash, I would execute the foreclosure and seize everything. Brock formulated a desperate, highly illegal contingency plan. He told Harold they needed to gut the company from the inside out before I could legally take possession. Brock raced back to the corporate headquarters and bypassed the standard accounting protocols. He contacted a black market liquidator operating out of Eastern Europe, a firm known for buying distressed industrial assets with zero questions asked. Brock offered to sell the entire inventory of raw manufacturing materials, the heavy processing machinery, and the fleet of commercial transport vehicles for $12 million in untraceable offshore cryptocurrency. It was pennies on the dollar, but it would give him enough liquid cash to flee the country and avoid the impending federal indictments for the safety violations. He ordered his loyal warehouse foreman to begin loading the equipment onto freight trucks under the cover of darkness. He drafted the emergency bills of sale, forging Harold's signature to expedite the transfer. He believed he was moving faster than the legal system. He completely underestimated the surveillance architecture of Vanguard Analytics. Inside the glass war room, Marcus alerted me the exact second Brock's credentials accessed the master inventory logs. My digital tripwires caught the sudden massive transfer requests of heavy machinery. I brought up the live satellite feeds from the Southside plant. We watched in real time as unmarked transport trucks began pulling into the loading docks. Brock was trying to strip the copper from the walls before the bank foreclosed. I did not call the police. I called my lead corporate litigator. I had anticipated Brock's cowardice the moment I bought the debt. We had already drafted the emergency injunctions. Within 15 minutes, a commercial judge reviewed our master promissory notes and the unredacted proof of Brock's unauthorized asset liquidation. The judge signed the freeze order immediately. I dispatched a fleet of private bonded security contractors to the manufacturing plant. They arrived just as Brock's warehouse managers were loading the first massive pallets of raw materials. My security team blocked the exit gates with armored vehicles. They stepped out under the harsh floodlights and handed the frantic warehouse managers the court-ordered injunction. Every single asset inside the factory was officially frozen under federal commercial lock and key. Nothing could be sold. Nothing could be moved. Anyone attempting to remove a single bolt from the property would be arrested for grand larceny and violation of a federal court order. The Eastern European liquidators took one look at the heavily armed security contractors and the judicial freeze orders. They immediately canceled the cryptocurrency wire transfers, completely terrified of being implicated in a massive corporate fraud scheme. They abandoned Brock's trucks at the loading dock and vanished into the night. Brock's emergency escape hatch slammed shut. He was trapped inside a rotting corporate shell with no cash, no leverage, and a massive federal target painted directly on his back. When the news of the frozen assets reached the family estate, the panic morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror. Harold realized that his entire legacy was dead. He could not sell the company, he could not borrow against it, and he could not escape the debt. The walls were rapidly closing in. Beatrice, driven entirely mad by the prospect of losing her social standing and her sprawling mansion, convinced Harold to make one final pathetic move. They could not fight me in the financial sector, and they could not defeat my algorithms. So they decided to weaponize the legal system using their absolute favorite tactic. They were going to play the victims. Harold and Beatrice drove straight to the county courthouse in the middle of the night. They bypassed their corporate attorneys and hired a sleazy, high-profile defense lawyer known for manipulating the press and manufacturing emotional spectacles. They marched into the magistrate's office and filed for a preliminary emergency restraining order against me. They claimed I was a financially abusive, mentally unstable predator who was actively terrorizing two defenseless senior citizens. They demanded the court issue an immediate injunction to halt my foreclosure, arguing that my actions were a targeted campaign of elder abuse designed to render them homeless and destitute. The emergency hearing was fast-tracked to Thursday morning. The courtroom was a sterile, oak-paneled echo chamber that felt entirely too small for the sheer volume of animosity radiating from the plaintiff's table. Harold and Beatrice sat flanking their newly retained defense attorney, a notoriously aggressive litigator named Vance Sterling. My parents had dressed specifically for the performance. Harold wore a slightly rumpled, outdated suit, his shoulders intentionally hunched to project vulnerability. Beatrice clutched a lace handkerchief, dabbing her dry eyes and trembling visibly whenever the magistrate looked in her direction. I sat calmly at the opposing table, flanked by my lead corporate litigator and Vanguard Analytics chief forensic accountant. I wore a tailored charcoal suit and maintained a completely unreadable expression. I watched my family orchestrate their theatrical display of victimhood with a clinical, detached fascination. They truly believed they could manipulate a federal judge the exact same way they had manipulated their social circle for decades. Sterling opened the proceedings with a fiery, impassioned monologue. He painted me as a vindictive, unstable daughter executing a calculated campaign of psychological and financial elder abuse. He claimed I had maliciously acquired Wilson Global Industries debt through shadowy offshore channels for the sole purpose of terrorizing my aging parents. He waved his hands dramatically, arguing that my court-ordered asset freeze was a weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at rendering two innocent senior citizens completely destitute. He formally requested a permanent restraining order, the immediate dissolution of the asset freeze, and a mandatory psychiatric evaluation for me. Judge Alvarez, a no-nonsense magistrate with sharp eyes and a reputation for crushing courtroom theatrics, listened to Sterling's speech with a neutral, rigid expression. When Sterling finally sat down out of breath and looking incredibly pleased with himself, Judge Alvarez turned his attention to my table. He asked my attorney if we had a response to these severe allegations. My attorney did not give an impassioned speech. He simply stood up, unlocked his leather briefcase, and handed a thick stack of bound, certified documents to the bailiff, who transferred them directly to the judge's bench. My attorney calmly stated that my actions were not elder abuse. They were a lawful fiduciary response to a massive, coordinated criminal conspiracy. He directed Judge Alvarez to the first exhibit. It was a complete forensic trace of Brock's initial embezzlement scheme, directly linking the drained corporate operating accounts to Brock's personal luxury purchases and his offshore gambling debts. Harold bolted upright in his chair, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. He shouted that corporate matters had absolutely nothing to do with a personal protective order. Judge Alvarez slammed his gavel down with explosive force, threatening to hold my father in contempt and have him removed from the courtroom if he spoke out of turn again. Harold sank back into his chair, visibly sweating. My attorney continued entirely unfazed by the outburst. He guided the judge to the second exhibit. It was the smoking gun regarding the origin of Brock's desperation. My brother had not just stolen from the company. When his offshore creditors came knocking last year, Brock had committed felony identity theft. He had illegally accessed a private secondary trust fund that my grandfather had established strictly in my name, a trust Harold had actively concealed from me during the reading of the will. Brock had used my social security number and forged my signature on multiple transfer authorizations, draining over $4 million of my personal inheritance to cover his margin calls. The documents showed Harold and Beatrice's signatures, right beside Brock's officially notarizing the fraudulent transfers under a falsified power of attorney. Beatrice gasped loudly, dropping her lace handkerchief onto the polished floor. Sterling turned and looked frantically at his clients. The aggressive litigator instantly realized they had lied to him about the depth of their legal exposure. He stammered a weak objection, claiming the documents were irrelevant to the immediate restraining order and completely unverified. My attorney ignored him and handed the judge the third exhibit. It was the complete time-stamped digital ledger of Brock's attempted midnight liquidation of the Southside manufacturing plant from 2 nights ago. It showed Brock actively forging Harold's signature on the commercial bills of sale, attempting to fence $12 million of federal assets to black market buyers. The accompanying encrypted emails, which Vanguard Analytics had decrypted, proved that Harold was completely aware of the illegal liquidation and had actively encouraged Brock to execute the sale before I could enforce my foreclosure rights. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. The fragile, elderly victim performance my parents had carefully orchestrated was thoroughly shattered. They had marched into a court of law, demanding protection from me, completely oblivious to the fact that they were handing a federal magistrate a detailed, documented map of their own profound felonies. Judge Alvarez spent 10 agonizing minutes reading through the financial records and the forensic communication logs. The color slowly drained from his face as he absorbed the sheer scale of the deception. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold, hard, and furious. He glared directly at Harold and Beatrice, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. He stated that in his 20 years on the bench, he had rarely seen such a blatant, repulsive abuse of the judicial system. He told my parents they had committed perjury by filing a false affidavit for a protective order in a desperate, transparent attempt to obstruct a lawful corporate foreclosure. He explicitly noted the forged signatures, the stolen trust funds, and the highly illegal asset liquidation attempts as clear evidence of deep-rooted criminality. Sterling tried to stand, attempting a rapid damage control maneuver. He offered to withdraw the restraining order petition, immediately hoping to stop the bleeding and get his clients out of the room. Judge Alvarez told him to sit down and remain completely silent. The judge declared that the petition for a restraining order was summarily denied with extreme prejudice. He upheld my asset freeze on Wilson Global Industries, permanently locking down every single piece of heavy machinery, raw material, and corporate bank account associated with my family. Then Judge Alvarez delivered the final devastating blow. He stated that the evidence presented in his courtroom today went far beyond a simple civil dispute or a corporate bankruptcy. He announced that he was formally rejecting the plaintiff's request to seal the proceedings. Instead, he was officially forwarding the entire dossier of forged documents, illegal wire transfers, and identity theft directly to the district attorney's white-collar crime division. He ordered an immediate, comprehensive forensic investigation into the personal and corporate finances of Harold Beatrice and Brock Wilson. The trap had slammed shut, and Brock was about to discover that the federal authorities were holding the key. The sheer velocity of Judge Alvarez's ruling sent immediate shockwaves through the remaining pillars of the Wilson empire. Within hours, the district attorney's white-collar crime division had officially frozen Harold and Beatrice's personal accounts pending a full forensic audit. Brock was effectively trapped in his luxury penthouse, his passport flagged by federal authorities as the investigation into the stolen trust funds and forged corporate documents escalated. The walls of their pristine, untouchable reality had completely collapsed, leaving them exposed to the brutal machinery of the justice system. But Tanya was still operating under the dangerous delusion that she was the smartest person in the room. While our parents were melting down, and Brock was drinking himself into a terrified stupor, Tanya recognized that the legal battle was no longer about saving the company or protecting the family legacy. It was strictly about saving herself. She knew the audio and video recordings of her bribing Arthur Halloway were the silver bullets that would completely obliterate her career, strip her of her license, and land her in a federal penitentiary. As a senior corporate attorney, Tanya understood the chain of custody. If she could destroy the primary source files, she could argue that any secondary copies released to the press or the authorities were inadmissible, manipulated, or illegally obtained. She believed that cutting off the head of the snake would solve all her problems. Tanya did not realize she was fighting a hydra. It happened at 2 in the morning on a Sunday. The Vanguard Analytics building was essentially a ghost town operating on a skeleton crew of overnight security. Marcus and I were wide awake in the subterranean war room fueled by black coffee and the relentless adrenaline of our final offensive. A silent alarm flashed a harsh amber warning across Marcus's primary monitor. Someone had bypassed the exterior electronic locks on the South Service entrance. We pulled up the high-definition surveillance feeds. The intruder was moving with urgent practiced precision, dressed entirely in black, her face obscured by a dark baseball cap and a heavy scarf. I did not need to see her face to recognize the rigid, arrogant posture of my older sister. Tanya had clearly leveraged her elite connections, likely calling in a massive favor from one of her law firm's shadowy private investigators to clone a master keycard. She slipped through the service corridors, bypassing the main lobby entirely, and took the freight elevator straight up to the executive floor. She moved exactly like a woman who believed the rules did not apply to her. I watched her approach the frosted glass doors of my private office suite. She pulled a small electronic decryption device from her jacket pocket, attaching it directly to the digital keypad. It took her less than 4 minutes to crack the local cipher. The heavy glass doors slid open and Tanya stepped into the heart of my operation. Marcus glanced over at me, his fingers hovering over the master control console. He asked if I wanted him to trigger the building lockdown and trap her inside. I shook my head, my eyes locked on the glowing monitor. I told him to wait. I wanted to let her dig her own grave. Tanya moved directly to my primary workstation. She pulled a heavy-duty solid-state drive from her bag and plugged it into the terminal. Her fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard. She was running a highly sophisticated aggressive wiping algorithm designed to locate corrupt and permanently overwrite classified data sectors. She thought she was executing a digital surgical strike. She believed she was erasing the Holloway bribery tapes, the Southside safety logs, and the undeniable proof of Brock's identity theft. On the surveillance feed, I watched Tanya's shoulders drop as a progress bar appeared on her screen. She let out a long, ragged exhale, pulling the scarf down from her face. Her expression was a sickening mixture of profound exhaustion and arrogant triumph. She actually smiled fully, believing she had just outsmarted me and saved her precious law license. She thought she had deleted the cloud files and scorched the local servers beyond recovery. What my sister lacked in technological expertise, she made up for in sheer, blinding hubris. Vanguard Analytics was not a standard corporate firm. We specialized in data fortification and cyber warfare. The terminal Tanya was currently hacking was nothing more than a localized dummy interface. The actual highly classified evidence was housed in a subterranean air-gapped server farm located 30 miles outside the city limits. Our off-site backups were completely immutable. They could not be altered, deleted, or overwritten by any external command, regardless of the security clearance level. Tanya was essentially burning down an empty house, while the treasure was locked in a concrete vault across town. I watched her pull the drive from the terminal, zip up her jacket, and turn to leave my office completely satisfied with her felony burglary. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the local police precinct. I bypassed the standard emergency dispatch and asked directly for the precinct captain, a man whose pension fund had recently been salvaged by one of my firm's algorithmic market corrections. I told him a burglary was currently in progress at the Vanguard Analytics executive floor. I gave him a precise physical description of the intruder and explicitly requested he send officers to intercept her at the South Service exit immediately. Marcus and I watched the external feeds as Tanya confidently strode out of the freight elevator on the ground floor. She pushed through the heavy metal exit doors and stepped out into the cold night air, fully expecting to slip away into the shadows and return to her pristine life. Instead, she walked directly into the blinding glare of 4 intersecting police cruisers. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated her stunned, horrified face. 3 armed officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands resting on their holsters, barking loud, clear commands for her to drop the bag and place her hands against the brick wall. The arrogant, untouchable corporate lawyer froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent collision with reality. I instructed Marcus to package the high-definition surveillance footage of her breaking and entering, along with the digital logs of her attempted data wipe. I was not going to let her plea bargain this away, and I was not going to let Harold buy her out of it. I was going to press maximum criminal charges for felony burglary, corporate espionage, and tampering with evidence. Tanya was about to be processed into the county jail, and I was going to make sure the entire legal community knew exactly why she was in handcuffs. The emergency hearing for the preliminary restraining order commenced at 9 o'clock the following morning. Harold and Beatrice arrived at the county courthouse looking exactly like the fragile, terrified victims they were pretending to be. My mother wore an understated gray dress, clutching a lace handkerchief and trembling visibly. My father hunched his broad shoulders, projecting the image of a weary patriarch broken by the cruelty of his own flesh and blood. They had retained Vance Sterling, a notoriously aggressive defense attorney, known for his theatrical courtroom performances. Sterling launched into a fiery monologue the second the magistrate called the room to order. He pointed a shaking finger at me, accusing me of orchestrating a calculated campaign of psychological torture. He claimed I was a deeply unstable, vindictive daughter who had maliciously acquired Wilson Global Industries' debt through shadowy offshore channels for the sole purpose of rendering my elderly parents destitute. He demanded a permanent restraining order and the immediate dissolution of my corporate asset freeze. I sat at the opposing table, flanked by my lead litigator and Vanguard Analytics chief forensic accountant. I maintained a completely unreadable expression, watching my family weaponize their tears with the same ruthless efficiency they had used to exile me years ago. They truly believed they could manipulate a federal judge the exact same way they manipulated their high society friends. When Sterling finally finished his breathless speech, the magistrate turned to my table. My attorney did not offer an impassioned rebuttal. He simply stood up, unlocked his briefcase, and submitted a thick stack of certified documents directly into the public court record. My lawyer calmly stated that my actions were not elder abuse, but a legally mandated fiduciary response to a massive coordinated criminal conspiracy. He directed the judge to the unredacted forensic ledgers. The documents provided undeniable proof of Brock's embezzlement, his illegal midnight liquidation attempts, and the devastating reality that Harold and Beatrice had actively forged my signature to drain my personal trust fund to cover Brock's offshore gambling debts. We also submitted the suppressed safety inspection reports from the Southside manufacturing plant, proving my father had knowingly poisoned his own factory workers to cut operational costs. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. The fragile victim performance my parents had carefully orchestrated shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The magistrate spent 10 agonizing minutes reading through the irrefutable evidence of their felonies. When he finally looked up, his expression was cold and merciless. He denied the restraining order with extreme prejudice. He upheld my asset freeze. Most importantly, he refused to seal the proceedings, officially forwarding the entire Vanguard Analytics dossier to the district attorney's white-collar crime division. Because the evidence had been submitted into the public record, to defeat the restraining order, the reporters sitting in the back of the courtroom gained immediate unrestricted access to the files. By noon, the manufacturing scandal hit the public eye with the force of a nuclear detonation. Every major news network and financial publication ran the story simultaneously. The headlines were merciless. They exposed the toxic ventilation cover-up, detailing exactly how the Wilson family had bribed safety foremen while their employees inhaled dangerous industrial chemicals. They published the money trails, proving Brock had siphoned corporate operating funds to pay illegal bookies. The pristine, untouchable facade of the Wilson empire was entirely obliterated in a matter of hours. Investigative journalists camped outside the corporate headquarters demanding answers about the forged documents and the stolen trust funds. When the opening bell rang on Wall Street the following morning, the market reaction was swift and violently unforgiving. Wilson Global Industries was a legacy publicly traded corporation heavily reliant on institutional investor confidence. The second the market opened, the stock went into an absolute freefall. Shareholder panic triggered algorithmic sell-offs. Mutual funds and pension portfolios dumped their holdings immediately, desperate to distance themselves from a company actively facing federal criminal indictments and a massive environmental safety scandal. The stock plummeted 40% in the first 30 minutes. Trading had to be halted twice before lunch to prevent a complete market collapse of the sector. The company's valuation was entirely incinerated, burning billions of dollars of institutional wealth to the ground. Instead of retaining criminal defense counsel and remaining silent, Harold's staggering narcissism drove him directly to the cameras. He genuinely believed his booming voice and practiced intimidation could bully reality into submission. He called an emergency press conference on the marble steps of his headquarters, flanked by his remaining visibly terrified executive board. Harold gripped the edges of the podium, his face flushed red with fury, and delivered a masterful performance of pure delusional projection. He did not issue an apology. He did not announce an internal investigation. He pointed the finger squarely at me. He announced on national television that Wilson Global Industries was the victim of a hostile, highly illegal financial attack orchestrated by an estranged, deeply disturbed family member. He claimed I had weaponized predatory debt acquisition and fabricated digital evidence to maliciously frame my own blood. He shouted into the microphones, declaring that he would not be intimidated by these terror tactics. He puffed out his chest and proudly guaranteed that his vast personal wealth stood fully behind the company, promising shareholders that he would inject his own private capital to stabilize the market and ensure operations continued uninterrupted. I watched the live broadcast from the Vanguard Analytics war room, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of his lies. Harold was doubling down, playing the victimized patriarch to a national audience completely oblivious to the digital guillotine dropping right behind his back. While Harold stood at that podium publicly guaranteeing the company's survival with his personal fortune, he had absolutely no idea that his fortune no longer existed. The district attorney's office had moved with devastating speed following the magistrate's referral. Armed with the unredacted proof of Harold and Beatrice notarizing the forged power of attorney to steal my inheritance, federal agents were actively serving emergency freeze orders to every single financial institution associated with my parents. The execution was total and silent. My digital tripwires monitored the banking networks in real time. I watched the red alerts cascade across my monitors. Harold's primary checking accounts were locked. Beatrice's luxury credit lines were suspended. Their joint savings portfolios, their offshore tax shelters, and their meticulously managed retirement trusts were seized by the federal government pending the criminal fraud investigation. They were officially stripped of every single dollar they possessed, completely destitute, while Harold proudly bragged on national television about his untouchable wealth. The absolute destruction of their finances and public image should have forced an immediate surrender. Any rational person would have called a lawyer and begged for a plea deal. But my mother was no longer operating in the realm of rationality. Beatrice retreated into a profound state of denial, driven by a madness born of pure social desperation. She convinced Harold that hiding would only make them look guilty. She genuinely believed that their elite social standing could somehow cure a federal criminal investigation and a total asset freeze. The annual Wilson Foundation Charity Gala was scheduled for that coming Saturday night. It was the most prestigious, exclusive event of the city's high society season, a lavish spectacle where my parents historically held court among billionaires, politicians, and celebrities. Against the frantic, screaming advice of their public relations team, Beatrice absolutely refused to cancel the event. She intended to use the gala as a show of unbothered strength. She planned to fill the grand ballroom of the city's most expensive hotel with their wealthy allies, drink expensive champagne on the foundation's credit, and rally their powerful network to crush me. She was so confident in her social armor that she actually sent an embossed gold leaf invitation directly to my office. It was a blatant, arrogant taunt challenging me to show my face in her territory. She wanted a social war completely unaware that her credit cards would decline at the catering office and her allies were already abandoning her. I held the gold invitation in my hands, a cold smile touching my lips. I RSVP'd immediately. The charity gala would not be their salvation. It would be the glittering, inescapable stage for their final ruin. To the Wilson Foundation, I announced, raising my glass high, and to the millions of dollars it has so generously distributed over the past decade. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. The crowd remained dead silent, hanging on my every word. Harold took a heavy step toward the stage, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "Cut the microphone," Harold barked at the sound technician in the corner. "Cut it right now." The technician did not move, his hands resting firmly on the soundboard. He was on my payroll now. I smiled down at my father, feeling the shift in power solidify in the room. "The microphone stays on Harold," I said, my voice projecting effortlessly over the crowd. "Because these good people deserve to know exactly what their generous donations have been funding. Marcus, if you would." Behind me, the massive digital screens that had been displaying the golden crest of the Wilson Foundation flickered. The elegant logo vanished, replaced instantly by a stark high-definition spreadsheet. It was a complex web of wire transfers, account numbers, and corporate entities, but Marcus had highlighted the key destinations in bright, unmistakable red. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. I watched a prominent state senator in the front row pull out his reading glasses, his jaw dropping slightly as he read the numbers projected on the screen. "What you are looking at," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, "is the internal, unredacted ledger of the Wilson Foundation for the past 5 years. You will notice that the funds earmarked for the downtown pediatric wing never actually made it to the hospital. Instead, they were routed through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands." "This is a total fabrication!" Brock yelled, his voice cracking as he shoved his way to the front of the crowd. He lunged toward the stage stairs but was immediately intercepted by 2 of my security guards. They crossed their arms, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle. Brock pointed a shaking finger at me. "She forged these documents. She is trying to destroy us because she was cut out of the family business." "I was not cut out, Brock," I corrected him, leaning into the wooden podium. "I walked away because I refused to sign off on your creative accounting. But since you want to talk about business, let us talk about your unparalleled financial acumen. Marcus, show them the next slide." The screen shifted instantly. It displayed a series of offshore casino receipts, luxury vehicle purchases, and massive wire transfers, moving from the Cayman Shell Company directly to a high roller account under Brock's name. The dates of the transfers matched the exact weeks of the Foundation's biggest annual charity drives. "That is $3.2 million, I stated, letting the massive number hang heavily in the tense air. "That is the pediatric wing, ladies and gentlemen. That is the Clean Water Initiative, traded for baccarat chips, sports cars, and VIP suites in Macau." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Donors began shouting questions at my father. A few of the smarter, more seasoned investors were already turning their backs and marching toward the exits, recognizing that simply being photographed in this room was a severe liability. Beatrice scrambled onto the first step of the stage, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as she grabbed the banister. Recognizing that Harold's intimidation and Brock's anger had failed, she opted for the only weapon she had left. She played the victim. "Elise, please stop this right now," Beatrice cried out, her voice pitching into a practiced hysterical sob. She turned to the restless crowd, placing a hand over her heart in a display of maternal agony. "Please, you must all understand my daughter has been unwell for a very long time. She has always harbored a deep, unnatural jealousy toward her brother. She spent time in a facility. She is not in her right mind. These are the delusions of a sick, vindictive girl who needs serious psychiatric help." I stared down at the woman who had spent my entire life gaslighting me, minimizing my achievements, and fiercely protecting the son who was actively destroying everything he touched. 7 years ago, standing in her lavish living room, she had called me a failure for refusing to participate in their systemic fraud. She had told me I would never amount to anything without the Wilson name. "A facility, Beatrice," I asked, my voice deadly calm, slicing through her theatrical sobbing. I tapped the edge of the podium. "Marcus, play the audio file from December 12th. The ballroom speakers crackled to life. Beatrice's own voice echoed through the vast space, sharp, commanding, and entirely devoid of the weeping fragility she was currently displaying. The recording played loud and clear. "I do not care how you structure the transfer, Harold. Just move the money from Elise's trust fund to cover Brock's margin call. If she finds out, tell her the market took a downturn. She is too stupid to understand the financials anyway. We cannot let Brock go to federal prison." The color entirely drained from Beatrice's face. She stumbled backward off the step, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Her sobbing routine vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. "You drained my inheritance to keep your golden boy out of jail," I said, my gaze sweeping the room, watching the horrified reactions of their former friends. "And when I discovered the missing funds, you threatened to have me committed if I spoke a word of it to the authorities. You relied on my silence and my fear to maintain your perfect, untouchable facade. But I am not afraid anymore, and I am certainly not silent." Harold was no longer yelling. He looked frantically around the room, making desperate eye contact with his board members, his corporate investors, his political allies. One by one, they looked away. The senator in the front row was already on his cell phone, practically jogging toward the coat check. The mass exodus began in earnest. The elite of the city were trampling each other to get out of the St. Jude ballroom, frantic to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Wilson family collapse. "You have destroyed us," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos of the fleeing crowd. He slumped into a velvet chair, suddenly looking like a very old, very broken man. "You took everything we built." "I took nothing but the truth, Harold," I replied, stepping away from the podium and walking down the stage stairs to stand directly in front of him. "You destroyed yourselves with your own greed. I simply turned on the lights." As if on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung violently open. They were not hotel security. It was a team of federal agents in dark windbreakers, accompanied by uniformed city police officers. They moved into the room with practiced tactical efficiency, their eyes locking immediately onto my father and brother. I had forwarded the entire unredacted digital portfolio to the Financial Crimes Division 3 hours before the gala began. They had been waiting in the loading dock for the event to start, ensuring all key players were gathered in one room. Brock tried to run. He sprinted toward the kitchen access doors, but 2 agents tackled him to the marble floor before he even reached the swinging panels. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed loudly over the diminishing murmur of the remaining crowd. Beatrice let out a genuine, piercing scream, dropping to her knees on the polished floor as an officer read her rights. 2 agents approached Harold. He did not fight them. He slowly stood up and offered his wrists. His eyes locked on mine with a mixture of profound hatred and utter disbelief. "I hope you are satisfied, Elise," he sneered as the metal snapped shut around his wrists. "You are no longer a part of this family." "I never was," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "I was just the collateral damage. But as you can see, I finally learned how to survive." I turned my back on them. I did not watch as they were marched out of the grand ballroom they had intended to use as their salvation. I walked through the emptying space, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The oppressive weight that I had carried since childhood, the constant need for their approval, the suffocating fear of their judgment, it was all entirely gone. I stepped out of the St. Jude Hotel and into the cold, clean night air. The storm had passed, leaving the city streets washed clean, and for the first time in my life, I breathed in the absolute unfiltered freedom of my own making. I raised my glass higher, ensuring every eye in the cavernous room was fixed on me. The crystal caught the harsh glare of the stage lights, casting fractured prisms across the podium. "To the Wilson Foundation," I declared. My voice rang out with absolute clarity, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. An institution built on the profound generosity of everyone in this room and utterly dismantled by the unparalleled greed of the three people standing right there in the center aisle. I pointed directly at Harold, Beatrice, and Brock. The sea of wealthy donors instinctively backed away from them. Within seconds, my family was isolated in a small, empty circle of hardwood floor, looking like cornered animals. Harold's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He abandoned all pretense of high society decorum and lunged toward the stage. He shouted at the sound technician in the corner, demanding he cut the microphone immediately. The technician did not even blink. He simply crossed his arms. He was on my payroll now. Everyone in the building was. "The microphone stays on Harold," I said, projecting my voice effortlessly over the rising murmurs of the crowd. "Because these good people deserve to know exactly what their massive charitable donations have been funding. Marcus, show them." Marcus stood near the edge of the stage and tapped a single key on his tablet. The enormous digital screens flanking the stage flickered. The elegant gold-embossed logo of the Wilson Foundation vanished. In its place, stark high-definition spreadsheets and scanned documents filled the screens. I heard a collective gasp ripple through the audience as prominent politicians and elite business owners scrambled to pull out their reading glasses. For the past 5 years, I continued pacing slowly across the stage. "My father and brother have aggressively solicited your money for the Oak Street Low-Income Housing Initiative. You wrote massive checks, believing you were putting safe, secure roofs over the heads of vulnerable families. Instead, you were funding Brock's offshore gambling debts and my mother's quiet acquisition of luxury real estate in Aspen." I gestured to the screen on my right. Bright red highlights illuminated a complex web of wire transfers moving from the Foundation's charity accounts directly into a Cayman Islands shell company and then straight into a Macau casino's high roller ledger. "This is a complete fabrication," Brock yelled. His voice cracked with panic as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "She forged these documents. She is insane. She has been trying to destroy this family for years." "I do not need to forge anything, Brock, when your own arrogance left such a pristine paper trail," I countered. "But the financial embezzlement is not even the worst part. Marcus, the inspection reports." The screens shifted again. This time they displayed internal emails bearing my father's official digital signature. Beside them were structural engineering reports stamped with bright red warning labels. The room grew deathly quiet. You could hear a pin drop as the city's elite read the damning words projected 20 feet high. "Look closely at those emails, ladies and gentlemen," I instructed the crowd. "Those are direct orders from Harold Wilson authorizing the use of substandard, unapproved building materials for the Oak Street project. Materials he knew explicitly would fail basic structural integrity tests. He bypassed safety regulations and pocketed the difference to cover the millions he and Brock had already stolen. He put innocent families into literal death traps just to maintain his country club lifestyle." Beatrice scrambled forward, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently. She clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "Do not listen to her," Beatrice pleaded with the crowd, her voice pitching into a hysterical sob. "My daughter has been unwell for a very long time. She is deeply disturbed. She is jealous of her brother. She needs psychiatric help, not an audience." I stared down at the woman who had spent my entire life gaslighting me, minimizing my achievements, and fiercely protecting the son who was actively destroying our family name. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical precision. "I am not disturbed, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly conversational tone that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "And I am certainly not jealous. I am your biggest creditor." Harold froze. The angry bluster evaporated from his face, replaced instantly by profound confusion. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "When the foundation started bleeding cash, you took out massive high-interest loans through private equity firms to keep the doors open and the parties funded," I explained, leaning into the podium. "What you failed to realize was who owned the firm buying up all your bad paper. Vanguard Analytics systematically acquired every single cent of the Wilson Foundation's debt over the last 18 months. I own the mortgages on your properties. I own the loans on your vehicles. I own the debt on the very clothes you are wearing tonight." Brock let out a harsh, barking laugh, though his eyes were wild with fear. "You are bluffing. You are full of it, Elise. We just secured a $50 million investment to stabilize the foundation. We deposited the check yesterday morning. We are fully capitalized." I offered him a smile that contained zero warmth. "You deposited a check from a dummy corporation managed entirely by Vanguard Analytics. You thought you found a savior. You thought an anonymous angel investor was bailing you out at the 11th hour. That $50 million was not a lifeline, Brock. It was a legal snare." The confusion on my brother's face was deeply satisfying. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking directly down into his terrified eyes. By injecting that specific amount of capital under those specific terms, I triggered a hostile takeover clause embedded deep within your debt covenants. I stated clearly, ensuring every business leader in the room heard the absolute finality of my words. That check was the mandatory deposit required to legally initiate involuntary bankruptcy proceedings against the Wilson Foundation and the Wilson family estate. Your assets are officially frozen. Your corporate accounts are locked. Your personal accounts have been seized. As of 9 o'clock this morning, you are entirely destitute. Beatrice let out a strangled cry and collapsed against Harold. My father looked like he had been physically struck. His knees buckled slightly, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The elite guests surrounding them were already moving aggressively toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the massive radioactive fallout of the Wilson Empire collapsing in real time. No one wanted to be photographed near a man who was about to be federally indicted for charity fraud and safety violations. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung violently open. They hit the walls with a resounding crash that stopped the fleeing crowd in their tracks. A team of men and women wearing dark windbreakers with bright yellow lettering across the back marched into the room. They moved with absolute tactical efficiency, parting the sea of wealthy socialites without uttering a single word. FBI agents. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and an expression carved from granite, marched directly toward the center of the ballroom. Her badge gleamed sharply under the crystal chandeliers. Behind her, a dozen armed agents fanned out systematically, blocking every exit, locking down the catering doors and securing the main elevators. "Brock Wilson," the lead agent announced, her voice booming, without the need for a microphone. "Jamal Tariq, Harold Wilson. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement of philanthropic funds, and federal racketeering." The name Jamal Tariq sent a visible shockwave through the few remaining board members. Jamal was my father's shadow, the brilliant, slippery chief financial officer who had engineered the Cayman Islands shell companies. He had been standing near the ice sculpture, quietly sipping a martini and pretending he was merely a guest. The moment his name rang out, Jamal dropped his glass. It shattered against the marble floor. He bolted toward the kitchen corridor, shoving a waiter out of his path. He barely made it 3 steps. 2 agents intercepted him, driving a shoulder into his chest and slamming him face first against a high-top table. Shrimp hors d'oeuvres and cocktail napkins flew into the air as Jamal's hands were yanked behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the dead-silent room. Brock did not run. He was too arrogant to believe he could actually be touched. As 2 agents approached him, he puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his custom tuxedo. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with?" Brock snarled, jabbing a finger at the lead agent. "I am a Wilson. I play golf with the federal judge in this district. You lay a hand on me, and I will have your badge by tomorrow morning." The agent did not flinch. She grabbed Brock's outstretched arm, twisted it sharply, and forced him onto his knees. Brock let out a high-pitched yelp of pain, his knees cracking hard against the floor. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited in a bored, monotonous tone, fastening the cuffs securely around Brock's wrists. "I highly suggest you use it." Harold stood frozen. His face was a mask of absolute terror. He looked at me, then at the agents, then at the massive digital screen above the stage, still displaying his fraudulent emails. An agent approached him, requesting him to turn around. My father, the untouchable titan of the city's real estate market, meekly complied. He offered no resistance as the steel cuffs locked around his wrists. His empire had dissolved in less than 5 minutes. Beatrice, however, refused to surrender her reality. Her golden child was kneeling on the floor in restraints, and her husband was being read his Miranda rights. She desperately clung to her delusion of superiority. "This is an outrage!" Beatrice shrieked, marching toward the lead agent with furious entitlement. "We are the hosts of this gala. We fund the police department pensions. You will release my son immediately. This is all a horrible misunderstanding caused by my deeply disturbed daughter." The lead agent turned to face my mother, her eyes sweeping up and down Beatrice's lavish outfit. "Beatrice Wilson," the agent said, pulling a folded warrant from her jacket pocket. "We have a federal seizure order for all assets purchased with stolen foundation funds. That includes the diamond collar currently around your neck and the emerald rings on your fingers. Take them off." Beatrice gasped, her hand instinctively flying to her throat to protect her jewels. "You cannot do this. These are family heirlooms. They were purchased 3 weeks ago using a corporate card linked to the Pediatric Wing Donation Fund," the agent countered, stepping closer. "Take them off, or I will remove them for you." Stripped of her stolen diamonds, Beatrice looked frantically around the room for salvation. She turned toward the front row of VIP tables, seeking the wealthy socialites she had spent decades cultivating. These were the women she hosted at high tea, the men she invited to private yacht parties, the politicians whose campaigns she funded. "Eleanor," Beatrice cried out, reaching a trembling hand toward the mayor's wife. "Eleanor, please call the police commissioner. Tell them this is a mistake." Eleanor Vanderbilt took a swift, deliberate step backward, pulling her silk shawl tightly around her shoulders. She looked at Beatrice with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not speak to me, Beatrice," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with ice. She turned to her husband. "Richard, get the car. I will not spend another second in the same room as these thieves." It was the signal the rest of the elite crowd needed. The socialites, the senators, the old money heirs, they all physically recoiled. They turned their backs on my parents, treating them like a highly contagious disease. I watched prominent businessmen furiously deleting photos from their phones, desperate to erase any digital evidence that they had attended a Wilson family event. The Whisper Network had already begun. By morning, the Wilson name would be synonymous with toxic disgrace. They were officially exiled from the only world they cared about. Beatrice realized the truth in that agonizing moment. The power, the prestige, the carefully curated illusion, it was all entirely dead. She had no money, no allies, and no escape. She was nothing. Her panicked eyes darted wildly before finally locking onto me. I stood calmly at the edge of the stage, watching the wreckage of their lives. Beatrice rushed forward, stumbling over the hem of her designer gown. She collapsed at the base of the stage, her hands desperately grasping at the fabric of my dress. "Elise!" She sobbed, tears ruining her immaculate makeup, leaving dark, messy streaks down her cheeks. "Elise, you have to stop this. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them it was a corporate error. You are a genius with numbers. You can fix the spreadsheet. We are your family. Please, you have to save us." I looked down at the woman who had abandoned me, mocked me, and tried to steal my future. I felt a profound, beautiful silence settle in my mind. "I only save things that have value," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet loud enough to shatter her last remaining shred of hope. I pulled my dress from her grasp, turned my back on her desperate sobbing, and walked steadily toward the exit. The heavy glass doors of the St. Jude Hotel slid shut behind me, instantly silencing the chaotic symphony of flashing sirens and shouted orders. I stepped onto the wet pavement. The city air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of impending rain and exhaust fumes, but to me it smelled like absolute victory. I did not look back at the grand ballroom windows. I did not wait to watch Harold and Brock being marched out in handcuffs, their faces shielded by tailored suit jackets. The spectacle was for the press. I had already witnessed the exact moment their empire crumbled, and that was all the closure I needed. The following weeks played out across the front pages of every major financial and social publication in the country. The dismantling of the Wilson legacy was incredibly swift and utterly merciless. Vanguard Analytics, operating under my direct orders, executed the bankruptcy proceedings with surgical precision. Harold and Brock faced a staggering list of federal indictments. The offshore accounts were seized, unraveling a decade of systemic embezzlement that horrified even the most cynical prosecutors. Denied bail due to the sheer magnitude of their flight risk and the Cayman connections, they traded their penthouse suites for federal holding cells. Beatrice's descent was a different kind of tragedy, one entirely of her own making. Stripped of the stolen assets, the luxury vehicles, and the frozen bank accounts, she found herself instantly radioactive in the social circles she had spent her life climbing. Her country club memberships were quietly revoked. The charity boards she once dominated scrubbed her name from their letterheads. Without Harold's stolen millions to prop up her lifestyle, the bank foreclosed on the family estate within a month. She was forced to move into a tiny rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, utterly isolated. She tried calling me twice from an unknown number. I listened to the voicemails once, hearing the same manipulative, victimized tone she had weaponized my entire life, and then I permanently blocked the number. The cord was cut. While they navigated the ruins of their greed, I set about rebuilding the collateral damage they had left behind. The hostile takeover of the Wilson Foundation allowed me to restructure the entire organization from the inside out. I fired every remaining board member who had turned a blind eye to Jamal and Harold's accounting tricks. I liquidated the empty shell companies and recovered a significant portion of the diverted charitable funds. The money they had stolen from the pediatric wing was fully restored, delivered with a quiet, anonymous wire transfer that ensured the hospital could finally break ground on the new facility. But I wanted to create something entirely my own, something that stood in direct opposition to everything my father represented. Using a portion of the Vanguard profits, I established the Josephine Initiative. It was a comprehensive scholarship and venture capital fund dedicated exclusively to supporting young women entering the technology and financial sectors. I wanted to find the brilliant, overlooked girls who were constantly told they were too ambitious, too analytical, or simply not enough. I provided full college tuition mentorship programs and seed money for female-founded startups. Where Harold had used his power to build walls and hoard wealth, I used mine to tear down barriers and open doors. The name of the initiative was the easiest decision I ever made. Grandma Josephine had been the only member of the Wilson family who ever saw me clearly. When the dust of the legal battles finally began to settle, I spent my afternoons sitting beside her bed in the quiet, sunlit room of her hospice care facility. Her health had been steadily declining for months, her once sharp mind occasionally drifting, but she always knew exactly who I was when I walked through the door. I sat with her on a Tuesday afternoon, holding her fragile, paper-thin hand. The television in the corner of the room was muted, displaying a news ticker about Harold's upcoming trial date. Josephine looked at the screen, then turned her pale, watery eyes toward me. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "You did it, Elise," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the oxygen machine. "You finally stopped them." "I had to, Grandma," I replied gently, smoothing a lock of silver hair away from her forehead. "They were going to destroy everything." "I always knew you had the steel for it," she said, her grip tightening slightly around my fingers. "Your father inherited the greed, but you inherited the spine. Do not ever let anyone make you apologize for protecting yourself." Those were some of the last coherent words she spoke to me. Grandma Josephine passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 days later. I handled the funeral arrangements myself, ensuring it was a quiet, dignified affair. Beatrice did not attend. Neither did any of the high society vultures who had once flocked to Josephine's lavish birthday parties. It was just me, Marcus, and a few of the dedicated nurses who had cared for her in her final days. As I stood by her grave, placing a single white rose on the polished stone, I felt a profound sense of peace. I mourned the grandmother who had loved me, but I did not mourn the family I had lost. You cannot mourn an illusion. 6 months after the gala, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office in downtown Seattle. I had relocated Vanguard Analytics, moving thousands of miles away from the toxic remnants of my past. The city skyline stretched out before me, a jagged landscape of glass and steel, catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk behind me. It was Marcus sending over the final approval documents for the latest round of Josephine Initiative scholarships. We were fully funding 20 brilliant young women this semester, giving them the exact safety net and leverage I had fought so desperately to build for myself. I signed the digital document with a quick, decisive stroke. There was no hesitation, no lingering shadow of Harold's expectations or Beatrice's crushing disappointment. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for 30 years was completely gone. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked back to the window, and watched the city pulse with life below. I was Elise. I was a CEO, a founder, and a survivor. The Wilson name no longer defined me, restricted me, or haunted me. I had burned their empire to the ground to forge my own key, and as I looked out at the limitless horizon, I knew I was finally truly free. The most profound lesson here is that your worth is never defined by toxic family members who deliberately misunderstand you. When resentful relatives attempt to diminish your hard-earned accomplishments, it reflects their deep-seated insecurities, not your actual value. True strength requires stepping away from the exhausting cycle of seeking conditional approval. By prioritizing your own personal growth, establishing unshakable financial independence, and fiercely protecting your peace, you forge a reality where their negativity cannot reach you. You simply owe yourself the respect they failed to provide. Please share your own experiences with setting strict family boundaries in the comments below.